Hey guys, GHAZZY TV here with another build guide. In this one, I'm going to show you the most broken build that I have ever played in my 8 years of Path of Exile. I should mention though that I have not touched or never bothered to touch the Delirium League Aura Stacker back in the days, which I've been told was actually a lot more broken than this. But it is the most broken that I have played. And yeah, it is the Forbidden Rite Totem build that is currently very much meta right now. However, it does come with quite a few issues, and I'm going to outline all of this in the build guide here below. We made a rough draft of this build before the league started, and I decided to fine-tune the POB and test the build out in the league itself, and I found this to be absolutely beautiful to play. The issues that people were talking about is quite easy to solve, and it's mostly about the defensive aspect, and I'll be covering that in the build guide as we're going to talk about them right here. However, I do want to mention as a quick note that is if you're new to my build guides and you're watching this video months from after it was posted, in some cases the videos are outdated. If this is the case, always make sure that you check the link in the descriptions below leading to my forum guide, which will always be updated before any new league releases. So make sure you check that. And with that out of the way, let's just dive into the guide, shall we? It's crucial to understand how Forbidden Rite works before going more in-depth with the actual guide. Now, the ability has a very low base damage, and this makes gem scaling less valuable on this build than it is with most other spell builds in the game, including minion builds. The way it works is that it has a low base damage, but it also takes a % of your life and energy shield to ramp up the base damage. And that's where the big source of damage is coming from. And scaling the gem level doesn't really skyrocket the damage efficiency, unlike it would do, or similar to how other spells in the game would actually approach with this. As gem scaling is one of the best ways to scale most spell builds, but not for this one. Another thing to mention is that the ability shoots one projectile, and then it adds one more projectile per nearby enemy, up to a maximum count of nearby enemies. This means that versus a single target situation, in our build using totems, it means that every totem will shoot 2 projectiles as a baseline projectile count versus single target, because it's a baseline of 1 projectile plus 1 for each nearby enemy, in this case a nearby boss. Thanks to testing done by Bower Mage, it has been confirmed that we can only hit a single target with 6 projectiles, and the AoE explosions from these projectiles is so small that it's not really worth scaling increased area of effect modifiers to allow for another projectile or 2 to hit. So 6 projectiles is the little sweet spot, if you will. However, there's a lot of different ways you can scale this, but I will be going through this in detail in the guide. So let's just take this information, and now that you have it, we're going to finally dig into the actual build guide. We start with a leveling approach, which is very easily done with a generic spell focus approach. Based on my testing, I feel that you should go with a standard Freezing Pulse and Orb Storms and Frost Bomb to start, and later switch into using Stormbrand and or Stormblast Mines, which will carry you all the way to Act 3. By simply using any support gems that would scale the damage, such as added Lightning, added Cold, and later in Act 2 you can get Elemental Focus or Control Destructions, and you can also get some of the Heralds during Act 2 to scale your spell damage, such as Herald of Thunder, Thunder, Ash, or Cold. In Act 3, however, you can switch your setup to run a Desecrate. Now, a Desecrate doesn't need to be linked with anything, but it does allow you to use Cremation. Cremation consumes a corpse to explode up a lot of extra damage, and this is something we want to combine with extra projectiles from something like Volley support, and then any other damage providing support gem scaling spell damage, such as Elemental Focus or Control Destructions. Now, with that approach, you could also switch your Stormbrand to an Armageddon brand, as we are then able to run a Combustion support gem there. It's crucial not to use Control Destruction support here on the actual Armageddon brand, as we want to have a small amount of crit to allow for Elemental Overload Keystone to proc from the tree to give you extra elemental damage. We also want to avoid using Elemental Focus on the Armageddon brand to allow for Combustion to function in these links. Do keep in mind that using brands for leveling allows for brand recall that you can get in Act 2 to make leveling smoother. Once you hit Act 5, you can make some minor changes to the tree, which I'll cover in this guide. Switch over to using totems if you want to, and the reason for this is that you're provided with a free Threshold Jewel in Act 5 from one of the quests. Once you have this, you can take the first Snow Threshold Jewel. This makes your freezing pulse have extra projectiles without needing any support gems. Now, using this instead of the previous Cremation and Armageddon setup, we'll be combining the freezing pulse with a spell totem support and then any other damage scaling supports. Try to avoid the control destructions again to make sure you have elemental overload being triggered. And once you've already been using a lot of these support gems, you should have them leveled and ready to go for a very smooth sailing experience till you switch to Forbidden Rite. It is possible to use Forbidden Rite at this point during Act 5 or 6, but I felt it to be smoother once you get your hands on the unique body armor Soul Mantle, which can be used from level 49 and forward. So at any point after Act 5 or 6 you want to switch to using Forbidden Rite, but it is recommended from my perspective to wait till you have the Soul Mantle with about 3 or 4 links on it, which is very easy to achieve. Once you do switch to the Soul Mantle though, it is crucial to understand how the self-cursing problem is tackled. And in this is done with a variety of solutions. However, this guide will be focusing on the very low budget friendly approach, which means they're gonna use 2 Kikasaru rings. These provides a total of 80% curse effectiveness reduction. Combining this with the tree nodes, either Asylum on the top left corner or Sanctum of Thought on the very far left corner of the tree, this pushes you to have 100% unaffected by curses on you. For endgame, we will increase the damage dealt by curses on you by using a self-flagellation jewel, so we take advantage of this downside. The other pro of having a 100% curse effectiveness reduction on you is that you are able to run any maps that has a curse effect on that you're being cursed with, because it's something that will actually be beneficial to you rather than detrimental. We also want to use a Spire of Stone to make sure your totems are never stunned, and this provides a ton of extra life for them, which ramps up a base damage they deal. I found that this is not a crucial jewel to need or use in the build, because I didn't feel that they got stunned that very often. It was very, very rare. However, the jewel itself is extremely cheap, and it provide the same amount of damage as a normal rare jewel with totem life. However, you do lose out on the possibility of getting yourself extra HP for using this, so I decided to actually keep using it in the low budget approach. Another jewel we want in the endgame is Rain of Splinters. Now this provides us with extra projectiles to again push us to that sweet spot of 6 projectiles per totem versus single target. With the leveling approach taken aside, we need to focus on the actual skill tree when you're leveling, and there's a couple things that you need to take into consideration with the tree as you're leveling. Now, it's not as generic as many other builds because we are going with a lot of elemental damage, which this tree for the endgame is not. The tree is mainly focused on actual totem life scaling and totem nodes and crit nodes and a cluster jewel, which I'll mention in a bit. So when you start leveling, you want to start by going in through these nodes over here, just taking the damage and the elemental damage nodes into Retribution. You want to go through the Discipline and Training and pick up both Light of Divinity and Holy Dominion all the way through to the life nodes of Devotion. Now this will give you a ton of extra life and damage, and it's very, very smooth to level with this approach. Now, if you decide to go totems, you have 2 different choices from this point on. And one is during Act 5, like I mentioned, going totems, you want to go all the way up and spec into Runebinder. However, we are leveling with brands early on. So the 2 decisions you have is to either rush up here and spec. I actually took the left side around because I felt that was actually better, so I didn't have to spend too many respec points from that we get through the campaign leveling sequence. And then you pick up the Runebinder instead of Ancestral Bond. This allows you to spec into Runebinder to get additional brand attached to enemies, doubling your single target damage from your actual brands, which is helped with the cremation. Now this is from Act 3 and forward, and in Act 5 you would have to respec out of the Runebinder and then pick up Ancestral Bond instead, of course. But for leveling, I would do the Runebinder spec, and once I have this, the other thing you can do before this would be to rush up here to pick up Elemental Overload by running up through these nodes and picking up Elemental Overload instead. Now this is a very smooth way to approach the build if you want to. It is not mandatory. I would rather personally start with going into the Runebinder, and right after Runebinder I would pick up Elemental Overload. So that's how I would personally approach the tree, and it would look around this way. This is a level 32 skill points in, level 28 from Act 3, with quest points being 3 and then killing all the bandits, which we are. So at level 28 we're at this point, which is around Act 3. So once you have this sorted, then you can do pretty much whatever you want at that point, because the next stages for this approach would be to either switch to the Forbidden Rite, which means that you would respec out of these elemental nodes and go with a more generic style, rushing preferably down to the Primal Manifestation first to get that extra totem life if you do decide to level with Forbidden Rite once you get access to that approach. The Sanctum of Thought nodes that we have down here is only something you will ever spec into once you equip the Soul Mantle, because it will then require you to use the 2 GHAZZY rings, and you need that extra 20% reduction of curses. Or you can choose to spec into these 3 nodes here, which cost you 1 point less, but you don't get the extra armor. This will also do the same thing for curses for you. Each of these small nodes is 5%, that's 10, and then additional 10 from the Asylum node itself. So you have those 2 as an option as well, to choose between Sanctum of Thought or Asylum when it comes to this approach. Other than that, the tree is very extremely generic, coming in with the leveling, because you just basically focus on picking up more damage from the totems. You can go into the Shaman's Dominion, more HP. The totems for the most part are carrying you once you start using them. Do keep in mind that the Threshold Jewel needs to actually function. You can place the Threshold Jewel over here in the Rain of Splinters because it works with the Intelligence Threshold Jewels. In here is only for Strength, so that would not work for it. This one here would work for Intelligence, so this is where you would put the first snow if you do decide to use the Freezy Pulse strategy. Now, in later levels, you want to respec out of these things, take away the Rune Binder, take away the Elemental Overload, and you want to take away the Elemental Damage nodes, and you want to focus on actual damage applications, and we're going to talk about the approach of scaling these things. Once you do this with Forbidden Rite, you can then spec into the Mind Over Matter. I would recommend that you pick up the Pursuit of Faith Ascendancy before you spec into any totems, because this will give you 3 totems instead of 2 with the Ancestral Bond. It also gives you totem placement speed and totem duration. Next node would definitely be the Ritual Awakening. Once you have this, I felt very comfortable specking Mind Over Matter, and you can use an Enduring Mana Flask to help you sustain defense early on. Now, with this approach, you just follow the tree. If you don't have any good crit scaling, which you normally don't during leveling, you prioritize nodes such as the Mental Rapidity for cast speed, get some extra mana for defense, get some extra HP, and pick up the Corruption nodes over here because you get penetration on chaos resistance here. Very, very strong nodes, and don't take the Sanctum of Thought or Asylum unless you're using Soul Mantle with a GHAZZY approach. Another approach to mention is the Cluster Jewel. The Cluster Jewel I am currently showing inside the tree right now is a Touch of Cruelty 12 passive jewel. You don't need a 12 passive. You can use anything from 8 to 12. The idea of this Cluster Jewel is to enable medium Cluster Jewels. So what you will simply do is buy the absolute cheapest Chaos Damage large Cluster Jewel that you can find. Now, when I played, I actually found a jewel that was 11 or 12 passive with chaos damage, a very low item level. Turns out that cost me a grand total 2 chaos if I had to buy it. All you can do is smack a couple of alterations and a regal, or you can just use some fossils if you have some available, which you normally don't on a league start, just to get some node. It doesn't really matter which one. Touch of Cruelty is a very nice one, which I would recommend if you have the currency to get that in the build, or just buy the base with it if it's not too expensive. So this is a very, very cheap approach. And the reason we're doing this is because once you get higher level on the low budget approach, we don't really have many other nodes that we want to strive towards, which allows us to fill out the rest of the points in this cluster jewel, but it's not a crucial thing to think about as you can upgrade it further down the road. So the main purpose of the cluster jewel that costs maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 chaos at best is to enable the medium clusters. Now the medium clusters are very, very, very important. And these are the most expensive items for this build. You don't need them until you get to around yellow and red tier maps, because that is where the defensive aspect of this build really starts to shine. There's going to be a lot of troubles with your delayed proxy damage playstyle, which is basically essentially you casting a totem, then the totem has to shoot the projectiles, then the projectiles have to have a travel time before they reach and hit the enemies. That's a lot of time where the enemies can hit you. So how to fix this issue? Not to mention the fact that the totems will be soaking up its own HP to shoot the actual spell. So the medium clusters you want to prioritize is a node called Ancestral Preservation. You don't need a 2 passive one. This 2 passive jewel that you can see in the PUB, it costs about 70 chaos. A jewel with only Ancestral Preservation, which you can alteration craft by buying the base, costs about the same, which is why we're having these two. So always check the market, but the only thing that is important is to get Answers of Preservation. This gives your totems extra HP, which scales your damage, makes the totems tankier, and also gives them chaos resistance. Normally, I would say that you should use 2 of these, which was very, very smooth, but I found out that only using 1 was more than enough for the low budget to make it really smooth to play, because the other cluster jewel will solve a very, very big problem, and that is enemies running towards you when you're trying to kill them with a Forbidden Rite, and that can be very, very scary when the build is not very tanky. So the other jewel cost half of what this jewel costs. And this one is with Repeater and Shrieking Bolts. The only thing you really need to focus on this jewel is getting the Shrieking Bolts. Now what Shrieking Bolts does is allows your projectiles to actually taunt the enemies. And now when you have 3, 4, 5 totems later to shoot out a ton of projectiles, each hit has a 10% chance to taunt the enemies, making the enemies actually attack your totems. And this is both beneficial for your safety, but also for your damage. And this is how you're going to approach the build in a low budget state. Obviously, the build guide linked in the description has the POB links for this, as well as the high budget version, which goes more in depth with the cluster jewel scaling. Now, the reason this scales our offense is 2 reasons. One is because of the projectiles needs to actually hit the enemy. And if the enemy is stationary trying to hit your totem, that means your more projectiles will actually be hitting rather than something chasing you when your projectiles will actually miss quite a few times. The reason it gives you damage on top of that is because we're using a 1 or 2 chaos pair of boots called Torch Oak Steps Antique Greaves. These will reflect 25% of their life as fire damage to nearby enemies when it's hit. So every time somebody attacks your totems, they will do 25% of their maximum life as fire damage. And these totems have a ton of life. So this is an extra damage approach. It also gives your totems 50% increased life. You can use these pair of boots from level 37. So whenever you're able to switch to Forbidden Rite, I would recommend combining that switch with the Torch Oak, which gives you a decent amount of movement speed and totem placement speed. But you need to get your resistances on the remaining rare pieces. Gear-wise, since we're going in here, let's go through them real quick. The main hand weapon should be a wand, preferably with either spell damage or cast speed implicit. The mods you're looking for is mainly either spell damage or chaos damage, and later you want to have some critical strike chance for spells. Critical strike multiplier is really good. If you can, outside of these modifiers, having projectile speed is actually really smooth. It's a nice quality of life addition. I did try this with Apep's Rage. The problem with Apep's Rage is that it increases the mana cost of your skills, which is very detrimental to the defense of the build scaling from Mind Over Matter. The shield that you want to go for on low budget, you want to use anything that gives you life and mana, preferably some spell damage and resistances. But for later in the end game, you want to get a Shaper Shield with a +1 to maximum summon totems. This is not very hard to achieve. I believe that I saw it on the market. They were going for about 25 to 30 chaos last I checked. However, this is for the end game. This allows you to do more damage, obviously, but it's not necessary for the early stage, and you're very easily able to allow to make concurrency to afford this type of shield. The helmet in the PoB is a simple life and mana, and we have the Soul Mantle, of course. The gloves are simple life and mana, same as we've been showing you in the gameplay footage across the board in this build guide. We have an amulet, which is using life and mana, and there's allocation of the Ironwood. Now for low budget, I would allocate this node down here, which requires clear amber and teal oil, giving you extra HP, more armor to the totems, and more defense for them, so they stay alive. Other than that, there's the belt, again, life mana. Make sure you have your attributes sorted, as well as your resistances. This is not something I'm including in my POBs. Make sure you cap those things. You want to use a diamond flask later. Other than that, get yourself an enduring mana flask, as well as a Quicksilver flask if you want to, and then just life flask and whatever else you feel like using. And then we have the Spires of Stone, which gives you the Totem Stun immunity, Rain of Splinters for the extra projectiles, as well as Self-Flagellation to scale the increased damage per curse on you. Other than that, the normal jewels, the only thing you want to focus on is finding totems that has either life or mana, depending on how you're sustaining the Mind Over Matter. And also Totem Life, which is the best damage scaling modifier you can get from these jewels, and they're not very expensive to get. To move on to the skills, we're going to start with the Forbidden Rite first. We are using Forbidden Rite with increased critical strike damage and increased critical strikes, as well as Void Manipulation and faster casting, and then Volley together with the Rain of Splinters totems and the fact that they shoot 2 projectiles versus single target, and having volley gives you 6 projectiles. You can switch volley to something else if you use a Dying Sun flask. Now that is a bit expensive and will not be included in the low budget. So what is the order of efficiency of the support gems? You want to use Forbidden Rite, and I'd say the volley is the next one, and the third one should be faster casting. Fourth one should be either crit or void manipulation, depending on if you're taking crit nodes on the tree, then crit should be better, but void manipulation is more generic. And the fifth one would be strikes, and then the sixth one would be the actual damage on your crits to scale that further. Utility options would be a steel skin together with increased duration, which you can have on left click, so when you're moving, you're automatically clicking up your steel skin to give you extra defense. I didn't have any other links in here. You can use anything you want to, a portal or a power if you can, but they're pretty expensive right now, so I left that slot open because there's no real reason to go with anything else. So these links that I'm showing you right now are very generic, and you can choose to do whatever you want with them. Mobility wise, I'm using a flame dash to get you over the pesky edges, and I'm actually using fast attacks with shield charge. What you can do in this setup is actually change the fast attack, flame dash, and use a 45, which I'm currently running to do some tests with, and then simply have the flame dash inside the 3-link utility plus flame dash as an example. So this is another way of playing it. It's all up to you how you want to do it, and depending on how your league start and the colors you have available, these are simple approaches to these utility options. Besides this, we have a setup with a Wither, Spell Totem, Multi-Totem, and faster casting. Now, before you think that this is going to lower your damage, it's important to note that multiple totems allows me to summon 2 additional totems on this specific spell. This allows me to, versus a boss, spam my Wither totem. So I have, in this case, I will have 7 totems. And once I have all of those totems out, and I then summon my Forbidden Rite totems, and in this PUB, you can have up to 5 Forbidden Rite totems, this would cause a situation where you have 2 Wither totems and 5 Forbidden Rite totems. So just make sure that you don't over summon your Wither totems after you've casted Forbidden Rite. Otherwise, it would be smoother for you to just self-cast the Wither, which I personally didn't like because I want to be able to be mobile and avoid dying. Other than that, we're using a Arcanist brand with Assassin's Mark, and I'm having a faster casting. Again, I didn't really know what to put in the last socket here to make it a really good setup. So you can choose to run whatever you want in this setup whatsoever. Besides that, we're using a golem, whichever golem you prefer to. I am running a lightning golem. If you want to be more defensive, you can have a chaos golem for damage mitigation, you can have a stone golem for life regen, but the lightning golem is for the offense, which is only used to ramp up with the minion life, and you can have a cutting strike to get the cutting strike effect on the golem, which is really nice. I decided to squeeze in elemental armor to give the minion a little bit of resistances, because it was quite often the golem would actually fall over and die, so I had to resummon it quite often, which wasn't really that much of a problem. And that basically covers the entire build guide. I hope you guys had use of this build guide. The links in the description leads to the full-blown written guide, including PUBs and detailed descriptions of everything you could ever need to get this build up and running. Now again, if you are watching this video months after it was posted, make sure you check the link to guarantee that you're checking the most up-to-date version of this build guide. Also make sure that you hit that goddamn like button and subscribe for more content so you can help support the channel. And leave a comment below what you think of the build guide. Till next time, Meixsells, stay safe and keep rocking.